Welcome to episode 4, where we are talking about setting healthy holiday boundaries. Oh yes, we are digging into boundaries. We're going to talk about what boundaries are, what they're not. We are going to talk about boundaries around the family dynamics with the holidays, especially given that we are still in the middle of COVID, and how we set boundaries with different people in our life, recognizing that those boundaries and the way we engage boundaries will be different depending on who we are having a conversation with. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Hey there, I'm Valerie Friedlander, Certified Life Business Alignment Coach, and this is Unlimited. This podcast bridges the individual and the societal, scientific and spiritual, positive and negative, nerdy and no, there's just a lot of nerdy. Come on board and let's unlock a life that's as badass as you are. Let's do something a little bit different in this episode because the first 3 episodes that I've done for this podcast have been very much foundational things, covering stuff that I talk about, that I utilize, some core concepts, as it were. And in this episode, I want to get more pertinent to the times. Right now, as this podcast is being released, we are in the second spike of COVID, and we are heading into the holidays. So things are a little interesting. I live in Chicago, so my kids have been home for the past, 8 months now? I don't know. Time doesn't really mean anything anymore. I am recording these late at night because it's really not quiet in my house until the kids are asleep. And my husband has taken over my office because he needs all of the monitors. And I am recording behind a curtain in my bedroom in my purple unicorn bathrobe because that's just how we're rolling right now. And this is an important time that we talk about the topic of boundaries, partly because it's such a hard thing to deal with all of the stuff going on a very personal level, just boundaries within the home and navigating dynamics of space and interaction when we are all mostly together most of the time. Then we throw in the dynamics of dealing with family and family expectations and what people need and want for holiday celebration and being present with one another, whether we're doing that in a physical way or whether we're doing that in a virtual way, and all of the dynamics that go along with that within a very divisive rhetoric happening in the United States. So that's why I wanted to talk about boundaries. How do we engage them? So because this is the first time I'm talking about boundaries, especially, I want to first address what are boundaries, because it's a word that gets used a lot, especially in the personal development space, but it's not one that we necessarily explain. And because of that, it ends up getting used in a really rigid kind of way when that actually might not be the most helpful way. And it may even create resistance to setting boundaries in the first place. So boundaries are not walls. They're not like this or else. And I mentioned the last time, like when we use the word always or never, that often indicates stress and rigidity and is coming from a more reactive place than a conscious, loving place. When we are setting healthy boundaries, we are setting them from a space of honoring our values, about expressing who we are to other people rather than trying to control other people and make them be different or be the way we want them to be. There's a saying, boundaries are where your responsibility ends and another person's begins. So they're standards of conduct that you set for your own benefit, not a rule that you enforce upon other people. And when you don't have clear boundaries, or when you have overly rigid boundaries, you tend to set up a dynamic where you won't hold to them because they're too rigid. Ultimately, boundaries are a communication. They're a form of expressing to other people. And depending on the relationship that you have with other people, they may need to be more strong, more fixed than with someone that maybe you have a trusting relationship with and you can have a conversation. An example of that might be with a client. Rather than having a conversation about when you're available to work with them, you might say, I answer my emails at these times. You can expect a response from me within 24 hours. That's a boundary because that is honoring your time, and it may set up something more for you than even for them. It sets expectations for them, but for you, it allows you to make sure that you're not checking your email constantly, which can be depleting, which can have you burn out. So setting a boundary like that, while it's with a client, it's for you and sets an expectation for them. Now, that's not something that you're going to have a negotiation around. You're not going to say, I need this, so how can we make that work for this relationship? That's not the conversation you're going to have with a client. With a spouse, however, it may be something along the lines of, well, actually, I'll just give you a real life scenario based on what I've already shared with this space situation. So when COVID first locked us all down, my husband was working from home and he needed the office because of the monitors and calls and things like that. And I'm fairly flexible. When I'm working one-to-one with a client, I do it via phone. So I can totally just come into the bedroom and close the door and have the call. So I would work in the dining room where the kids were doing their schoolwork and be out there with them. And then I would come in for calls, or I would kick my husband out for video calls and he would come work in the dining room. That became really stressful for me because I did not like to ask him to leave the office. It was a hassle to go back and forth, and I would resist doing the things that I wanted to do because the emotional dynamic, when I knew he had deadlines and he was going to be more stressed out if I would ask him to leave, I didn't want to ask him to leave, so I just didn't take that time. Then I was feeling frustrated because I wasn't getting the time that I needed. Not to mention just having my own space. I didn't realize how important that was. I tend to identify as an extrovert, though if you listen to I think it was the second episode, and I talked about my issues with having binaries and extrovert and introvert and stuff like that. But I do tend to feel recharged around people. Not as much little people, though. Love my kids, but little people conversations and adult conversations, very different. So I noticed that I was getting more irritable. I was feeling frustrated. I was feeling resentful. And as I mentioned in the last episode talking about stress, that told me that was a space that I needed to pay attention to and that I might need to do something around. And I thought about, what do I need? I always encourage people not just to look at the pain of like what I want to go away, but what would be helpful for me. And for me, I realized I really needed a space where I could close the door, that I could have my own space. And I talked to my husband about it, and he invited me to set up in the office with him. Like we could set up another area in the same room. And he had his reasons of it would just be simpler and not running cords and blah, blah. And I thought about that. I was like, well, could that work? And no, because we'd still have the same issue where when I was doing group coaching, I would need him to leave. And we would have the same issue for me emotionally and then with his schedule. Also, I really just wanted my own space. He was not keen on having an office set up in the bedroom. All the things that say this is not a good idea to have an office space in the bedroom. And that felt upsetting to me because I felt like he was dismissing my needs, that it was okay for me to be inconvenienced, but it was not okay for him to be inconvenienced, as in having an office in the bedroom, or my having an office in the bedroom. And that, of course, was me feeling victimized, right? You notice the language that I used there, like he's doing this to me. And so this is a space where I needed to set a boundary. I needed to say, look, one way or another, I need a space where I can close the door and have privacy. Honestly, it wasn't really that important to me what that looked like exactly, but I needed to have that space. So we were able to sit down and look at the options. And this is where that was the boundary. My value was for me to have my own space, to have there's a sense of freedom in being able to close the door. And we were able to sit down and have a conversation about what could that look like and brainstorm and come up with a solution. So that's another way of setting boundaries, is knowing what the root of it is. Then you can have a conversation around the execution of it. Like, how do we actually make that work? There are other instances of setting boundaries that I would hear a number of times in work around dealing with people with substance issues. So saying, I love you and I want to hang out with you. I'm not willing to hang out with you when you've been partaking in substances. However, when you choose not to do that, I would love to spend time. Or, hey, let's go to this event. Will you be drinking? Yes. I'm going to choose not to go to that one. But if there's another one where that's not going to be present, I would be happy to go. Now, it may be that there are no opportunities to do that. Like every event that the other person chooses to go to has that. And so because of that boundary, the consequence of that is that we never go to an event. And that's a choice. So it's recognizing that it's about making a choice. That's what boundaries are. And there's a communication that happens there. Without having clear boundaries and that sense of who you are and who you want to be and what you're about and what's important to you, it leads to feeling like a victim of other people's view of who you are or the way you should be, or overcommitting and burning out and creating a misalignment. So how does this relate to family stuff? Well, it's everything. I don't know. You probably figured that. It's like, well, family dynamics are all about boundaries or lack thereof, and setting those boundaries and communicating those boundaries. So as I mentioned, having strong communication skills really helps when it comes to boundaries, as well as a self-awareness. Going back to making the focus on you, knowing what you have power over and what you don't have power over. You don't have power over other people, places, and things. You do have power over yourself. So that's actually one of the first things that I'll invite people to do when they're setting boundaries or working on setting boundaries, is make a little chart where you have one side that says what I have control over and the other side that says what I don't have control over. Once you identify those things, then you can recognize what boundaries you can set to take care of yourself in whatever situation it is. It could be, say, someone is giving unsolicited advice. And that happens a lot with family. If you want to share something and you have family who are always wanting to put their 2 cents in and say, oh, well, do this or this, that, or other thing, or my opinion is, and you didn't ask. You just wanted to share something with them. It is totally appropriate to say something along the lines of, I really value your opinion and I want to be able to share things with you. sometimes I'm not looking for an opinion. I just want to share it. So unless I ask, I'd appreciate it if you would keep your opinion to yourself. Now, might someone be upset by that? Yeah, that can happen. The thing with boundaries is that, especially if people aren't used to you setting boundaries, they can get a little bent out of shape. That might be an understatement. People feel sometimes when you set a boundary that you're infringing on them. And actually, let me go back, because with something like that, with a boundary like that, where you say to them, hey, I really appreciate your opinions. I really value your opinions. And there are times when I'd love to share things with you, but I'm not looking for an opinion. You can say, would it be possible for you to not share your opinion unless I ask for it? And I promise that I'll ask for it when I want it. The answer may be yes. Yeah, absolutely, I can do that. And then they don't. And then you learn, okay, the boundary actually needs to be not sharing if I don't want an opinion. This person finds it really hard not to give an opinion when you're talking about something. So if you don't want an opinion, don't share with them unless you do want that, right? So that's taking in information and adjusting accordingly. When you set a boundary or make a request of that nature, state what your needs are, either asking, how do we make this work? Or saying, this is what needs to happen. If this can't happen, then I can't come. Such as with COVID right now, you may have something where you have family who might not be as cautious as your family is being. And that would make you uncomfortable with getting together. And it's more difficult because the level of specificity that we have to get to, because we all have very divergent sense of safety or caution around this virus, you do have to get very specific. And that can feel uncomfortable because it can feel judgmental, because there is so much judgment in general around that. I find it really helpful to recognize that no one can push a button that I don't have. So if I'm feeling defensive, if I'm feeling upset, that's about me. And that's something going on for me to look at. If somebody else gets defensive and upset, that is theirs. That is not my responsibility. I can ask them about it. I can take in information so that I might want to shift how I'm approaching it, but it's not mine to do something with. So saying, I would love to get together. I'm concerned about health. So the only way that I'm comfortable getting together is if everyone involved quarantines for 2 weeks before we all get together. And if everyone's willing to do that, then I would be happy to have us all be together. If everyone is not willing to do that, then you can start discussing alternatives. Well, what would be another option? We could meet up outside with masks and be socially distant. You know, I hate that term, actually. It's physically distant, but whatever. So you can say, that would be acceptable. But if you're traveling, what are the things around traveling? How do you feel about rest stops? There are a lot of different things to cover to identify what level supports your needs. And it may be, you know what, that logistically that just doesn't work. For example, with my family, we had an instance where we didn't feel comfortable going unless we were quarantining for 2 weeks, but then we would have to quarantine for another 2 weeks coming back. And so we wouldn't have any food in the house. And that was problematic. So we had to find a workaround for that. There are lots of logistics to consider with something like this. So identifying what are the things that are important to you. And it may be what's really important to me is being able to enjoy time with the family. And I won't be able to do that if we are physically together. What could we come up with? What creative solutions could we find to spend time together virtually? Maybe it's silly. Maybe it feels silly to do that. But if you are hanging out with people and feeling uncomfortable the entire time, And that happened to me early on when we got together. There was bad air quality in Chicago, so we drove down to Nashville, and the whole time we were there, I was plagued with anxiety attacks every time I felt like coughing. I knew we'd done everything we could, but it was really hard to enjoy our time together. So coming up with other ideas of things that we could do. There are places you can Google options. There are games you can play online. I thought about like, oh, if we all had the game Apples to Apples, we could play that virtually. We could set up the computer and eat dinner and have the computer on. I mean, there's so many different ways that could be approached. They may not be ideal. And when you set a boundary, you do have to recognize that other people have the right to set boundaries too. And their boundary may be, if you're not coming, we're not spending time together. And that's why knowing what your values are and what's really important to you is so key. You can't control other people and what they decide to do with the information that you provide. And there may be a backlash. Oftentimes, especially if people aren't used to you setting boundaries, there will be, because they feel like it's an imposition on them. I knew someone who never used to say no, ever. She would say yes to everything. And when she finally said no to something, the person that she was talking to was so used to her saying yes that they didn't even hear her. Like, totally ignored it. Not because they were maliciously ignoring it. It was really just because it was so different and out of the norm for their interaction. Their brain didn't compute it, because our brains like patterns and it tends to look for what's familiar. And since that was not a familiar component in their relationship, it just did. She had to say it multiple times because it just didn't compute. So you may feel like you're having to like really emphasize a boundary. And it's not that the other person is necessarily even being mean or even being upset. It may just be something that's not fitting within the way they're thinking. Or it may feel like you're disrupting what they believe should be. And that can be upsetting to somebody. That's about them. That is their stuff. You can set boundaries in a very loving way, and still people will get upset because if they're not used to it, or if it interrupts what they want. And everyone's allowed to have their reactions. And going back to stress and understanding stress, that initial stress reaction may dissipate if we don't jump into it immediately upon its arrival, right? Like somebody might have an initial upset reaction and give them time to think about it, and they'll come around and go, okay, now I'm ready to actually talk about it. If you push someone's button and they have a reaction, remember that that's reaction, not necessarily what will eventually come as they come around. So you can even ask for space then. This is what I'd like. Let's take some time to think about it and come back together. And I know that this might be upsetting for you, and I know this isn't what you would ideally like. This is really important to me. So it's not up for negotiation. I would, however, love to talk further about ways that we can support each other or find ways that we could creatively solve this difficult situation that doesn't impede this basic boundary. So just going back, boundaries help define who you are and what you're about to the people around you. They highlight priorities, they highlight values, and life's non-negotiables. Some basic tools for boundary setting are taking some time to check in on your values, asking yourself, is saying yes to whatever is being asked or whatever's going on, saying no to me? So by my saying yes, I could continue to sit in the dining room, was saying no to me and what my needs were, which ultimately was getting me more and more irritable, which was also saying no to my value of taking care of my family. Saying yes to going to be with family was saying no to me in that I was consciously anxious and not honoring my needs for a sense of security. It's not fear-based in this case. There's a lot of talk around not being afraid and taking action out of fear. I believe that you can do a risk assessment for yourself and honor what's important to you without it being based in fear. everyone has their opinions, and that's just what this is. So when you take that time to really check in with who do you want to be? What are your values? What's really important to you? And then taking that time to sit down and have solid communication, being clear and specific, remembering that people don't read minds and you can't read their minds. So thinking that other people should know whatever is going on for you or should have the same sense of things as you do is thinking that there's a right way to think and a wrong way to think and a right way to feel and a wrong way to feel. And that's not necessarily true. And that can lead to additional stress and tension with other people. Other people need to know how you feel in order to have the opportunity for you both to continue making informed decisions. So showing up in a way where you are listening and respecting their feelings, even if you don't agree with them, even if the answer is still no, respecting and caring that they have that feeling does not necessarily mean not having a boundary. It can just mean listening and being present to that and still saying, and this is important, I'm willing to find solutions that support us both while honoring the boundary that I have around this so that I can continue to show up in a loving way. Because when you start overstepping your boundaries and threatening your values and putting yourself on the back burner, that is a sure way to not show up as your best self. And if that is something that's important to you, which it probably is if you're listening to this podcast, it's really important to take that time. And it does take time. So giving yourself that time and that space to really consider what's important and to really sit down and have hard conversations, uncomfortable conversations with other people where you are listening and asking them to listen. And then if they're not willing to listen and respect what you're saying and what your needs are and come to the table with solutions, then that's more information to feed into what kind of boundaries that you need to set with them. All right. So I know this is a really difficult time and this is a really hard topic with a lot of people, given how different people are seeing the world these days. So if that is something that you would like support around, let's chat. I do offer a free initial exploration session where we can absolutely explore boundaries and what would be a loving way for you to show up to the dynamics that you're facing and set healthy boundaries for you to support you being the person that you want to be in the relationships and in your life. There is a link in the show notes, and I would love to speak with you. If you have questions and you are not ready to get on a call with me, please shoot me an email and let me know. I know that this is going to be a topic that will come up a lot, and we will probably be talking about boundaries, just even if there's not a whole episode about it, like it's just a theme. It's a big, big, big one. So send me your questions. I would love to dig into them here on the podcast. And if you want to chat, I'm here for that too. Talk to you next time. Thanks for listening. I so appreciate you being here. If you got something out of today's episode, please share it. Leave me a review, take a screenshot, and post it on social with a shout out to me. Send it to a friend or, all of the above. Want to hang out more? Join me on Instagram. Or better yet, get on my mailing list to make sure you don't miss out on anything. And remember, your possibilities are as unlimited as you are. Allow yourself to shine, my friend. The world needs your light. See you next time.